May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Please be seated. Well, someday I will learn that during Pride Month we don't read the second reading, so my sermon can't be about the second reading, but my sermon is about the second reading. And so this excerpt from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians will have to suffice. Paul says, "We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet are well known, as dying and see we are alive, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything." In this passage from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he articulates the profound disjunction that he has experienced between the world's perceptions of him and his own inner spiritual realities. And this is a disjunction, a discrepancy, a discordance that has been familiar to many Christians throughout history. It is perhaps most profoundly exemplified, however, by the experiences of so many African people forcibly brought to the United States as slaves, who in the midst of slavery's degradations still found an interior freedom in and through their faith. Indeed, it feels particularly apropos to reflect on the history of Black Christianity and the Black church today, since we have just celebrated Juneteenth, that great day when the news of emancipation and the military power needed to enforce it finally made it to the doorsteps of those enslaved in Texas. The eminent historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., in his book, The Black Church, This is Our Story, This is Our Song, has the following to say about the spiritual roots of the often extraordinary resilience of enslaved people in the Americas. I'll quote him at some length. Gates states, "One of the greatest achievements in the long history of civilization, as far as I am concerned, is the extraordinary resilience of the African American community under slavery, through the sheer will and determination of these men and women to live to see another day, to thrive. What sustained our ancestors under the nightmare of enslavement, to build families and survive their being ripped apart and sold off in the domestic trade, to carry on despite not being able to ward off the rapacious sexual advances of their masters, a verity exposed by DNA which shows that the average African American is more than 24% European, to acquire skills, to create a variety of complex cultural forms, to withstand torture, debasement, and suffocating denial of their right to learn to read and write, and defer the gratification of freedom from bondage, all without ever giving up the hope of liberty when slavery had no end in sight. What empowered them with hope against hope?" The writer Darrell Pickney, in a recent essay, notes that if a person cannot imagine a future, then we would say that that person is depressed. To paraphrase Pickney's next line, if a people cannot imagine a future, then its culture will die. And Black culture didn't die. For the signal aspects of African American culture were planted, watered, given light, and nurtured in the Black church, out of the reach and away from the watchful eyes of those who would choke the life out of it. Gates then continues, elucidating the ways in which the Black church has served as the central locus for the development of Black culture. He argues, again quoting at some length, "We have to give the church its due as a source of our ancestors' unfathomable resiliency, and perhaps the first formalized site for the collective fashioning and development of so many African American aesthetic forms. Only in the church could all of the arts emerge, be on display, practiced and perfected, and expressed at one time and in one place, including music, dance and song, rhetoric and oratory, poetry and prose, textual exegesis and interpretation, memorization, reading and writing, the dramatic arts and scripting, call and response, signifying and indirection, philosophizing and theorizing, and of course, mastering all of the flowers of speech." The Black church was the cultural cauldron that Black people created to combat a system designed to crush their spirit. Collectively and with enormous effort, they refused to allow that to happen. And the culture they created was sublime, awesome, majestic, lofty, glorious, and at all points subversive of the larger culture of enslavement that sought to destroy their humanity. The miracle of African American survival can be traced directly to the miraculous ways that our ancestors reinvented the religion that their masters thought would keep them subservient. Rather, that religion enabled them and their descendants to learn, to grow, to develop, to interpret and reinvent the world in which they were trapped. It enabled them to bide their time, ultimately, time for them to fight for their freedom. It also gave them the moral authority to turn the mirror of religion back on their masters and to indict the nation for its original sin of allowing their enslavement. I've quoted Gates at length because so few of us have any kind of immersive experience in the world of the Black church or in any of the other branches of Christianity that have been shaped by theologies of liberation. Theologies of liberation, of course, take as fundamental truth that God speaks in a particular way through the poor, through the oppressed, and the marginalized. And that, in turn, the Bible can only be properly understood when it is interpreted from the perspective of the poor, the marginalized, and the oppressed. Historically, the Episcopal Church has been a church with significant social capital and significant social power. The Episcopal Church has not tended to be the spiritual home of choice for those on the margins of society, which means that the Episcopal Church has not, at least historically, been particularly fertile soil for liberation theology. Today, in many places, this remains the case, as segments of the Episcopal Church strive to maintain a sense of status and prestige. And yet, as the Episcopal Church has become increasingly receptive to women's spiritual authority and spiritual leadership, and as we have increasingly become a refuge for LGBTQ+ persons, the Episcopal Church is also becoming a place where liberation theology ought to have a voice. Indeed, in so many Episcopal parishes, including our own, there are individuals who can wholeheartedly join Paul in saying, "We are treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet are well known, as dying and see we are alive, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything." There are people among us who have had to learn to guard their inner integrity against all manner of external threat. There are people among us whose own experiences of seeking to live authentically, often without the validation of family, church, or society, have helped them to discover the deeper truth of the gospel, the truth that within all experiences of death, germs of resurrection can be found. Within all experiences of death, germs of resurrection can be found. While many Christians have had to take this resurrection business on faith, others have faced death, spiritual death, moral death, emotional death, physical death, and discovered the truth of resurrection faith in their own lived, embodied experience. And it is to these persons that we need to turn, I believe, as we seek to be a church that embodies a transformative and liberating faith in the midst of the ecological, social, political, and spiritual turmoil of our time. And what might these persons have to say to us? What might they have to say about what liberation could look like here in the suburbs among people with all kinds of ostensible privilege? As a person who can claim at least some experience as once being lost and now being found, a key realization for me has been that my own liberation is necessarily bound up with the liberation of all other people who experience oppression. Unjust systems damage everyone's humanity, even those who are generally the beneficiaries of these systems. I particularly like the following articulation of how this works for white people in relationship to racial justice. A writer for a Quaker organization puts it like this: "The cost of white privilege and white supremacy for white people is nothing short of trading in humanity for the illusion of comfort. In order to cash in on the privileges and benefits of white supremacy, white people must fear, disown, demean, ignore, dehumanize, exoticize, murder, incarcerate, and segregate ourselves from people of color. This writer further suggests that naming the ways in which white supremacy wounds white people is a way of moving past a helping or service model to become co-conspirators and comrades in the movement for racial justice. If we seek to become a church of liberation, how might we begin? Perhaps we might conceive of Paul's predicament of being misunderstood by the world around him less as a tragedy than as a spiritual goal. The world might indeed be a better place if Christians were treated as imposters and yet true, as unknown and yet known, as dying and see we are alive, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing yet possessing everything, as having nothing yet possessing everything. May it be so.